Welcome to part 3 of my review of Gerald Bray's A History of Christian Theology. Now, if you missed parts 1 and 2, I would encourage you to follow the links in this review to check those out in order to have a balanced view of this book. I say that because I think the first half of this book was very well written and a great overview of the development of Christian theology throughout the first 1500 years of church history, while stretching slightly into the years following the Protestant Reformation. Now, since this is a Trinitarian theology, as we enter the third section of the book, it is a section on the Holy Spirit, under the main headings, the person of the Spirit and the work of the Spirit. And sadly, in this third section, I think Bray kind of jumped off the tracks when he hit the section on the work of the Spirit. I say this for a couple of reasons. One, I had to remind myself constantly that this was the section on the Holy Spirit. The first section on the person of the Spirit clearly focused on the third person of the Trinity, and I did feel like in the first two major portions of the book, the Father and the Son, those were appropriately on the Father and Son. But once he hit the section on the work of the Spirit, it seems like he kind of left the Holy Spirit behind. Now, I do see how you can argue that you should place bibliology under the Spirit because the Spirit inspired the Word, or ecclesiology under the Spirit because the Spirit preserves the church, but I really feel like the Holy Spirit was lost most of the time. And in a large section under the heading of the Holy Spirit, Bray spends about 2 pages on the modern charismatic movement. Now, I'm no charismatic, but the movement is huge and international and has been very deeply impacting theology in many ways for about 100 years. So I am very confused about how Bray made the editorial decisions to focus on what he did and also why he left out many of the things that he did. My feelings on this book took a 180-degree turn once I hit the work of the Spirit. But if you're interested in hearing me tell you a little bit more about my thoughts on Bray's work on the Holy Spirit in A History of Christian Theology, a Trinitarian approach, please give me a few more minutes of your time. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to learn about the background of our theology, please subscribe to the channel to stay up with my latest book reviews. Also, give this review a share in order to let others know about the work of Gerald Bray. If this review at all makes it seem like I am just out to get Bray, please watch the first 2, where I am very positive of the book. I'm just disappointed at what he did in this portion. Now, the major section on the Holy Spirit, it started well with Bray's usual excellence in tracking through church history and showing how certain events led to the development of specific points of theology. So for instance, he writes how as late as the 15th century, even those who sided with Rome didn't rest their authority on the Roman Pope, but on councils, not an individual. And it was more in a response to the Protestant Reformation that they began to claim for papal apostolicity and to see the Pope as the singular authority of the church. He also had a wonderful section on the positive growth of individual prayer and Bible reading and how walking the Christian walk was beginning to transition to a practice for all Christians and not just the professionals, the monks, the priests, and the nuns, and how this transition was beginning even before the Reformation, and what the Reformation did was just add fuel to that small growing fire. His coverage on the development of the doctrine of the person of the Spirit, I felt was thorough and well done, but then he got to the Spirit's works, and he kind of lost me. It started when Bray was writing on the inspiration of the Bible. He spent some time on interpretation at this point, talking about the 1,000-year reign of Christ in Revelation chapter 20, and how early church writers took it as literal and futuristic, and how Augustine put a stop to that interpretation, ended a futuristic view of Revelation. Then he spent an entirety of one whole paragraph on dispensationalism, where he said Darby and dispensationalists had a status of orthodox. He even put orthodox in quote to tell you that they just had a status of orthodox because they have a large number of people who adhered to it, but they weren't really orthodox. And then I couldn't believe what he wrote at the end of that paragraph when he said dispensationalism is rapidly retreating into the countercultural undergrowth from which it emerged. I would love to know what he means by we emerged out of this countercultural undergrowth and now we're going back into it. Are dispensationalists just supposed to be walked over and dismissed? It seems that way because in a book on 1,200 pages of the history of Christian theology, he spends a paragraph on dispensationalism, almost entirely negative, where he's like, we're barely orthodox. And thankfully, that undergrowth is back under our feet again. It was just ridiculous and biased and unfair. In that same area of the book, Bray spent 10 pages on the overview of the book, The Imitation of Christ. And it was actually a really great overview. One of my favorite parts in the section on the Holy Spirit. It was wonderful coverage on living the Christian life. But I was also thinking while I was reading this, I'm confused as to how one book out of all the books written in church history got 10 pages of coverage while entire theological movements received less than a page. Now, I'm not only talking about dispensationalism, but Anabaptists are also kind of thrown under the bus along with Arminians. I don't remember anything positive about Balthasar Hubmaier, and his work was excellent and it deserves recognition in a book on a history of Christian theology. Menno Simons is also barely mentioned, and then accused of being overly harsh to his followers toward the end of his life. And I found that accusation especially bizarre. Menno Simons overly harsh because Zwingli and Calvin oversaw people being killed. And yet it is Menno who is accused of being harsh, while John Calvin actually received a paragraph defending him in the controversy over Michael Servetus. Arminians are relegated in this book to being a group that the church should not allow an open door for them to enter, while at the same time, if you look at the Reformed characters from this same similar area, you have Beza being called a living legend. John Owen authors the greatest work on the Holy Spirit. Jonathan Edwards is said to be the greatest theologian colonial America produced. Covenant theology is said to triumph. And I'm sorry to Gerald Bray and the editors of this book, but I came for a historical narrative of how theology developed throughout the numerous Christian traditions, and not a work that was meant to present Reformed theology as the pinnacle of Christian theology. And I just find it a shame that Bray made these decisions and turned this book into sort of a historical apologetic for Reformed theology, because even for someone who's not Reformed, it was great for hundreds of pages. Well, then once I hit that section on the work of the Holy Spirit, I felt like all the fair coverage was gone. Now, if you held to Reformed views, you were praised, you were defended, you were seen as holding the orthodox place in the church. If you weren't, your struggles would be highlighted and your place would be small. Someone who would be introduced to church history or theological history would never come away with a balanced view of the history of Christian theology from the mid-1500s up until today from this book. So here is where I really struggle with the history of Christian theology. Pages 1 to 735 were very good. I give them a strong recommendation. But then pages 735 to 982, I was literally writing the word no at times on the side of a page and crossing things off because I disagreed so strongly with what I wrote, with what was written, and felt that the book was morphing into a defense of Reformed theology and a salute to Gerald Bray's favorite theologians. And then a complaint that I lodged in the last review, that at times it's tough to determine if what Bray is writing are his personal views or the views that he's covering at that point in history. Well, that issue was magnified by tenfold in the section on the works of the Spirit. So I have a new opinion now on a history of Christian theology, and I gotta start by saying this is a delightful book for 735 pages. Delightful. If you purchase this book, I think almost regardless of what Protestant stripe you're going to come from, you will find that 2/3 of this book is well worth the price. And for a book that clocks in at over 1,200 pages, that's a lot of material. But once Reformed theology, covenant theology begin to enter the scene in his section on the work of the Spirit, I'm guessing that most readers who aren't followers of the Reformed tradition will be calling foul and bias again and again. Now, if you are Reformed and you're watching this, and I'm sure you've come to this conclusion already, you're going to love it. You probably won't even notice the bias. You'll be like, oh, Jonathan Edwards is totally the greatest theologian that colonial America ever produced. And I would say you're going to continue to love this. But if you're not Reformed, you'll probably want to look elsewhere for a history of theology after the Protestant Reformation. And I'm kind of disappointed to say that because I wanted this to be a great review for the entire thing because I enjoyed the beginning sections of it so much.